So Spanish is one of the most widely spread languages in the modern world. And one question I get as a Spanish teacher is what dialect, what country should I focus on? Because even though it is all one language, it is far from uniform. Whether you're in the Caribbean, Mexico, or Argentina, in each region it takes on its own special flair, it uses its own special slang, and it even sometimes sounds quite different. And in the beginning, I don't think it behooves anybody to focus on one specific dialect, with the caveat that if you are living abroad in that place, then yes, maybe you start to study their variety of Spanish beforehand. But if you want to just be able to travel, or you're just trying to decide where you want to live, my suggestion would be that you just learn basic standard Latin American Spanish, right? Because at the end of the day, most of the vocab is the same for most things, right? The thing that changes the most between the countries is the slang and some pronunciation things, right? And we can deal with that stuff later. As we choose where we want to spend time, or we just travel there more often, we will naturally start to acquire a little bit more of their accent, right? But I don't think it's a good idea to just pick and choose an accent to start to learn from the very beginning. Today, we're going to talk about some of the different varieties of Spanish, the influences of other languages on them, some of their key characteristics, and then my personal journey with learning Spanish in school, and then how I chose and settled on a dialect later on, which is not quite how you think it went. So let's start out with one of the most distinct and universally understood to be the hardest varieties to understand, which is Chilean Spanish. Chilean Spanish is a challenge for most because they speak very fast, they have a tendency to cut letters off of words, and they change pretty significantly the way normal words are pronounced, right? In addition to this, they have all kinds of weird slang like cachaco, weon, which are not heard in a lot of other places. So one of the biggest things you find in Chile is the tendency to drop the D and the S, right? So esta sounds more like eta, or muchachos, you're going to drop the S at the end, muchacho, lo muchacho. Also, the D falls out in some words, like pescado sounds more like pescado, right? But more so, it's the dropping of the S and the fact that they run the words together, they speak really fast, and they have like very distinctive twang, right? If you ever talk to somebody from the deep south or from like West Virginia, you kind of talking about in English, you can understand them, but you really got to pay attention, right? They got a weird intonation and a little bit of a weird slang, a little bit of a weird tone that you really have to be paying attention to. You have heavy influences from the Mapudungun language, the language of the Mapuche, and some other vocab, as well as French and German influence from historical relations with those countries. However, Chilean Spanish stands out for its really weird rhythm, right? So be warned, if you're trying to learn Chilean Spanish right off the bat, if you love Santiago, if you just want to explore the Patagonia area, the side of Chile, it's a cool dialect. It's really fun to play around with, but it can be quite hard due to its speed and the dropping of sounds that it has. Next up, we have Rio Platense Spanish, which we find in Uruguay, Paraguay, and most famously, Argentina. One of the biggest things that sets this dialect apart is the sound of Y and L. So it's not yo me llamo, but rather yo me llamo. Estamos en la calle, right? They, just like the Chileans, also tend to drop the S off the end of words, right? So be aware of that. Also in Argentina, they use the word vos. Vos is really just a alternative for tu, right? But it does have its own conjugations. The biggest thing being that in the present tense, the emphasis shifts to that last syllable. So it's not tu hablas, it's tu hablas. It's not tu comes, it's vos comes, right? And it's not tu vives, but rather vos vivis. This dialect was influenced by a ton of migration from Italy, specifically Europe, just in general. They've got Welsh, they've got German, but Italy definitely had the biggest influence. And to me, Rio Platense Spanish sounds like an Italian trying to speak Spanish. Obviously, they're speaking Spanish, but they have a lot of Italian words, most of which have taken on new meanings, and they sound kind of that, and they have that kind of musical, rhythmic quality to it. The next one we're going to talk about is Caribbean Spanish. This was my first real life exposure to Spanish. I went to the Dominican Republic on 2 mission trips. I also spent 2 weeks traveling around there when I was first traveling alone. It was my first ever trip by myself. I went for 2 weeks and traveled around. It's really cool. But one thing I learned about these places is, just like Chile, they speak so fast, right? They speak almost faster than the Chileans, and they have a more of a tendency to drop off certain words, right? Especially like the Cubans, it sounds like they just left the dentist, right? The mouth is still numb, and they just speak so fast. They drop off the S's, like we've talked about in other dialects, right? And that dropping of the D, which you see in Chile to an extent, is much more common in the islands. Whether that is, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican, or some of the coastal parts of like Colombia and Venezuela as well, follow these same trends. This dialect had a huge influence by the African diaspora. They have a lot of interesting words. They also have a lot of interesting like religious, which I find really cool. But this accent is very fast-paced, full of rhythm, and very lively, right? It can sometimes be challenging for learners. It can sometimes be challenging even for, native speaker Mexicans who go to the Dominican. They look around and are like, what the heck is going on, right? So don't feel bad if you right away. But the good news is, because of their influence on music, from reggaeton to salsa to bachata, you have the opportunity to get yourself exposure to this dialect and get used to it if you're happening to take a trip out there. And another huge thing that you'll see, specifically in Puerto Rico, places like Miami, which I guess isn't technically Latin America, but we're going to count it, is the use of heavy Spanglish, right? Where they switch back and forth between Spanish and English in one sentence. Maybe they drop in a word in one while continuing the rest of the sentence in the other language, right? And so you have to have control of both in order to be able to follow along these conversations, right? But the ability to code switch is very important to have. It's a good skill to learn. And it's also really fun to play around with once you get the hang of it, right? I do this a lot with like my friends who I know speak both, right? I'll say whatever expression sounds better or feels like it best captures the moment, and I know that they're going to understand, right? There's no problem with that. Next up, we have like Colombian Spanish. This is pretty much universally regarded as the clearest and like easiest to understand dialect of Spanish. In some areas, you'll hear, especially in the Amazon side, like some of the indigenous languages, but for the most part, it's super clear, super easy to use. And this is like the base, most standard variety of Spanish that you could ever possibly want. However, if you do make it up to the Caribbean coast, like we were talking about with the Caribbean accents, you are going to get some of those traits. Things like dropping the S, they're going to speak a little faster, they're going to be a little bit more lively in their body language and their expressions, right? So do be prepared for that. I think that pretty much just a general consensus. Colombian Spanish is kind of the ideal if you're wanting to get into learning Spanish, right? It's basic in terms of its pronunciation. Its vocabulary tends to be pretty standard, right? And between this or maybe Mexican Spanish, it's probably the one that is heard the most often and is most universally recognized. And then the last major one I want to talk about is Mexican Spanish, right? Mexican Spanish is a really nice option to learn because it follows really standard pronunciation rules. There's not too much crazy slang, but even the slang that is used is pretty universally known and has even been exported to other countries and is used there, where it's like chido or que padre, que onda, things like that, right? And the good thing about their slang expressions is they are very pegajoso, they're very sticky, right? They're very fun to say and they're very easy to learn for the most part. You benefit in Mexico from the amount of film that comes out of Mexico, the amount of music that comes out of Mexico. So if you do decide to learn that Mexican version of Spanish, you're going to be understood in most places most of the time, right? Even if you do use slang words like way or que onda or chido, things like that, right? Like I've done this, I've gone abroad to other places since living here in Mexico, namely Chile and Argentina, and sometimes those slang expressions have slipped out instead of me reverting back to like a standard Spanish, just to make sure I'm understood by everybody, right? But even then, most people know what I'm saying, right? Most people know those expressions. They have some experience and some exposure to them through things like social media, through literature, and through film and music. So for me, when I first started out learning Spanish, I learned it in school, and I just focused on like a generalized, basic, school-ish Latin American Spanish, right? Something that I knew that the base of the vocabulary is going to be understood in most parts of Latin America in most countries by most people, right? And from there, I could start to adapt it a little bit. Like at first, I went after more of a Dominican Caribbean flavor. I started to listen to a lot of bachata and reggaeton. I used shadowing techniques to kind of start to copy them and improve my accent, right? And start to pick up a little bit of their version of Spanish. After this, I went and lived for a year in Spain. I definitely picked up on their slang. I definitely started to sound a lot like them. I used the word tío all the time, que dices tío, right? And had the very Spanish accent. And up until that point, that was interesting because I never really used vosotros. But in Spain, I learned it just through being around it. And now I feel kind of comfortable to use it. It'll take me a second or two to like think sometimes, but for the most part, I'm able to use it now. And then after that, I moved to Mexico. I started to travel around. And funnily enough, I started when I first got to Mexico to hang out with a bunch of Argentinians, right? And for me, the Argentinian accent is like very smooth, very nice sounding, and it's very sticky. Like it's a very easy accent to copy. It's very melodic, and it's a lot of fun. And so by hanging out with all these Argentinians, I started to pick up a little bit of the Argentinian accent, specifically in like my intonation and the like up and down method of speaking, right? I didn't necessarily grab the like sh sound, like yo me llamo, a little bit, sometimes, but for the most part, it was more just the like, hey, estamos aquí en México, ¿cómo estás, amigo? Estamos por ir a jugar fútbol, ta ta ta. It's very fun accent. And then after that, I dove and started to live more full time in Mexico. My Spanish is definitely at this point very Mexican, especially in terms of the vocab I use and a lot of the way I talk, sometimes depending on who I'm talking with. But if you ask most people, they're kind of like, you're not from my country. Right? If you ask a Mexican, they're going to tell you that I'm not Mexican, which is very true. But they're also not going to necessarily know where I'm from. Right? And then last year when I went to Chile, I started studying a little bit of the Chilean accent. I had met a couple of Chilean people, and so I knew it was going to be difficult, so I wanted to put the study in beforehand to kind of know kind of their key slang words, kind of be aware of some of the sounds that are a little different, right? Kind of pay attention to a little bit of the speed. I listened to a lot of their music before I went down there. It's a really fun language. Like words like cachai, putting ball at the end of words. That one specifically has kind of stuck with me a little bit, depending on who I'm talking with. Chilean, very fun. Definitely not the accent I would choose to focus on if it was first starting out. Just because it's so rare. You really don't hear it outside of Chile. There's not a whole lot of Chilean immigrants to most places, right? I would definitely suggest that you start either with Mexican Spanish or Colombian Spanish. So, what do you guys think? Which one should you learn, right? I think it comes down to a few things. One is like travel. Are you going to be traveling a lot in Spain? Well, you definitely need to learn the Spain version of Spanish. If you're going to be traveling a lot in Latin America, a more generalized Latin American Spanish would be good, right? Now, if you're going to live in a certain country, that's when I would suggest that you need to learn that variety of the language. Another thing to keep in mind is like the materials that are out there to learn it. Like Colombian, Mexican, and at this point Argentinian Spanish has a lot because you get lots of radio shows, you get a lot of sports games, you get a lot of music, right? There's lots of resources for you to start to shadow and imitate their accent, right? And so if you don't want to just pick like a standard Latin American Spanish and you're not going to Spain, those are probably the three I would tell you guys to pick from, either Argentinian, Mexican, or Colombian versions of Spanish. They're going to help you to be understood in most countries by most people. They're going to be the easiest to understand and pick up your right. And for me, are the three best options for a beginner learner in Spanish once they want to choose to focus on a dialect. Right? If you guys disagree with me, leave it down in the comments. What dialect of Spanish do you think that people should start out learning? If you guys have anything else you want me to cover, be sure to leave it down there as well. If you're interested in classes, be sure to send me a message. Use the information down below in the description to sign up. Otherwise, thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video.